Today we will take a look at our first president, George Washington's life. I have put together a timeline that we will go through with pictures and video to expand on each period of time in his life. First, we will look at his younger years. George was born on February 22nd in Virginia on 1732. He grew up on a farm, and his first occupation besides his farming was a land surveyor, which he began in 1749. George Washington grew up on a farm. Now we will take a look at his young adult life, but specifically his military career. In 1754, he began his military career in the French and Indian War. Later, from 1755 to 1758, he commanded Virginia's frontier troops. In 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis. George was then elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army in 1775. He showed great courage on and off of the battlefield. Last, we will look at his involvement of America's freedom, his presidency, and then his later years. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. Washington's victory in Yorktown in 1781 helped beat the British Empire. In 1787, he was elected president of the Constitutional Convention. The people of the United States of America elected George Washington to be the first president of the United States in 1789. Then, in 1793, he was re-elected as president. George Washington retires to his home in Mount Vernon in 1797, and sadly, he passes away in his home in Mount Vernon in 1799. George proved to be an excellent leader. Due to his leadership skills, he was the obvious candidate for the first president of the United States.
Washington's intelligence and perhaps his political savvy. But what you cannot debate was the fact that this man was the embodiment of the revolution, and in fact now would become the embodiment of the new American Republic.
Washington is the only president who was ever unanimously elected, who ever got every single vote in the Electoral College, and he got that twice.
Number 1, George Washington, Federalist, 1789 to 1797, 57 years old, from Virginia. George Washington's inauguration took place on April 30th, 1789 at Federal Hall in New York City. As the first man to take the oath of office, Washington added the words, "So help me God," establishing the very first presidential precedent.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
So help me God.
At best, Washington was apprehensive about his new job. After leaving his home at Mount Vernon, he wrote, "My movements to the chair of government will be accompanied with feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution. I greatly fear that my countrymen will expect too much from me." many questions about this new job, this president person.
People wondered, what do you say? How do you describe this person, this man who was going to head the United States of America? His Excellency?
We could laugh about it a bit, I suppose.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
But think for a moment what it would be like in our own time if the Sergeant at Arms had to introduce the President today as His Mightiness, His Excellency, His High Mightiness, the President of the United States and Defender of our Liberties. That, in fact, was one of the titles suggested for the President.
And he said, no, 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 call me Mr. President. And, I mean, that's a nice gesture. Doesn't mean much, but it's a nice gesture.
It almost meant nothing at all. Just weeks after taking office, Washington came down with a rare bacterial infection. Some believe it may have been anthrax picked up on a farm. Washington nearly died, which could have wrecked the fragile new republic.
American historians have spent more than 2 centuries now trying to dig up dirt on George Washington, to find the flaws in Washington. It's a tough chore.
For a long time, Washington was thought of as a nice guy, sort of a boob, not real smart, famous for being tall.
George Washington brought many personal qualities to the presidency. His dignity, integrity, and honesty are well known. But he also had his quirks.
He refused to shake hands when he became president. He thought that was beneath the presidency.
It was all part of establishing the image of the presidency. One example is how Washington projected his physical being.
George Washington was the most athletic, the most robust, the most dynamic of all the founding fathers. He was the action hero, if you will, of the 18th century, who was considered by Jefferson the best horseback rider of the entire period.
Washington usually rode a white horse named Nelson, and Nelson became a vital part of Washington's public relations package. His version of a tailhook landing.
When he would visit towns during the presidency, sometimes he would travel in the comfort of a carriage most of the distance between towns, but in many cases he would hop out of that carriage and get on to Nelson and ride into town looking like $1 million.
George Washington has many achievements during his lifetime, but specifically in his presidency. To name a few, during his presidency in 1793, Washington laid the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. He was also in office when the Bill of Rights became a law. In 1798, before he had passed away, he was a commissioned lieutenant general and commander-in-chief of the new United States Army. He was a farmer, a soldier, and a president. George helped lead America to independence, leaving our nation to fondly remember him as one of our founding fathers.